Hello, I'm Nicole Keleher. I'm the Forest Health Director with the Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation's Forest Health Program, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the oak decline and mortality here in Massachusetts. We are currently at the tail end of an oak mortality event throughout the state. So starting around 2015 and peaking in 2018 with a little bit more mortality in 2019 and 2020, we've seen widespread loss of our oaks throughout the Commonwealth. So as seen in this image, scattered dead trees for large scales across the landscape, areas where we have higher densities and we've lost individual stands of oaks, areas through communities, residential areas, wet areas, forested areas, losing scattered oaks. So it's a very widespread issue throughout Massachusetts, accumulating in about 60,000 acres of lost trees. And these trees are very ecologically significant throughout the state. It impacted all of our major oak species. So out in central Massachusetts, really hard hitting in our northern red oaks, out in our coastal areas, getting our black oak and scrub oak species that are really important to those habitats. So all of our unique ecotypes and oak forests were heavily impacted by this slow oak decline and then widespread mortality that we saw. And when it peaked in 2019, where we saw the hugest numbers of oak mortality, it's kind of captured in this, our aerial survey for that year, where we saw areas that had these pretty large quantities of dead trees, and it's shown in red on this map. There are other areas throughout the state that did have oak mortality, but we take this data while flying in a small airplane about 2,000 feet above the ground. So when the number of oaks, when the percent of dead trees are usually below 5%, it can be kind of hard to map and quantify that. So most of this data shows mortality in the 5 to 10% range. So when it says 57,000 acres of oak mortality, we didn't lose every single oak in 57,000 acres, but we did have 57,000 acres where we were able to easily identify areas impacted by oak mortality. So acreage that saw typically that 5 to 10% loss of trees. Of course, there are smaller areas that lost up to 90% of their oaks. And there are some areas that we mapped that probably are only in that 3 to 4% range, but it was easy for us to be able to pick out those larger trees and identify that. And the event that really kicked off our loss of oaks and this widespread event was a gypsy moth outbreak event. So gypsy moth is nothing new to Massachusetts. It's been here for over 150 years, and we've gone through these large outbreak event cycles where populations will build for 2 years, peak, and then kind of fall back down for a year or two after the peak. And in the early 20th century, it was really common to have these cycles kind of continue every 10 years. In the late 20th century, Entomophilum omega, which is a very host-specific pathogenic fungi, was introduced and quickly dispersed across our landscape, and it caused significant mortality to the gypsy moth population, and has kind of kept the population at low numbers since the 1990s. So in the past 25 to 30 years, we really didn't see very much activity from gypsy moth. But then in 2014, 2015, the population kind of started building up. So we can see 2015, we start to have some areas where we have started noticeable populations, noticeable defoliation building up. And we had areas in the past, in the early 2000s, where you'd have pockets, but not over so much of the state like this. And then really in 2016, those individual pockets really started to blow up into these larger areas where it was more widespread, more continuous swaths of areas impacted, getting a lot of notice from people living in areas, seeing caterpillars feeding, hearing their poop falling down, having completely bare trees. And it peaked in 2017 with over 900,000 acres. So this is the second largest outbreak event that's been mapped. 1981 had about 2 million acres estimated impacted across the state. Um, and then earlier than that, we didn't have the same ability to capture data we do now. So this could be one of the bigger events that we've ever seen here in Massachusetts. But luckily, it peaked in 2017, started going down in 2018, and by 2019, we just had a few small pockets left. In 2020, we were not able to complete our aerial survey due to everything that was going on with COVID restrictions and 3 people squeezing into a small plane that's smaller than a Prius. So we didn't have specific data, but from ground surveys and anecdotal evidence, it seems that the population was low again in 2020. So when we look at those 3 heavy years, so 2015 to 2018, the areas that were defoliated and kind of overlay that, we see multiple places throughout the state that had this continual, relentless impact year after year. So our oaks are resilient, they're hardy, they're pretty strong trees that can overcome a lot. So if they get completely defoliated, lose every single leaf, they can push out new leaves by mid-July, um, and kind of survive through a complete defoliation event. And a very healthy oak can actually do this up to 3 times. So completely be defoliated and able to push out leaves in a year, and next year be able to do the same thing. But when you hit that 3-year threshold, that's kind of the limit for a lot of the oaks. They don't have the energy stores in their root systems. They're not building enough photosynthesis in those years that they're being impacted. And they just really can't overcome that pressure. When trees have additional stressors, it reduces down. So in 2 years, or even a very stressed tree, just 1 year of defoliation can cause quick decline and lead to mortality. So there are many areas in the state that did hit that 3-year in a row heavy defoliation, and some places in the state that had the 4 full years in a row of full defoliation of many of the oaks in the area. So when we look at the numbers, we can kind of see our defoliation slowly built up for those 3 years and then kind of drop back down for the next 2. And we can see a little bit of a lag as the oak mortality. So the trees don't die that first year from the defoliation. Usually it takes a year or 2 afterwards to see a peak in the mortality. And the mortality events can kind of trail off for up to 4 or so years afterwards that we kind of consider related to this event. Um, and a lot of that is factors of other stressors and how the gypsy moth kind of impacts the trees. So there are a lot of factors that can impact the gypsy moth population and why we kind of see these cycles and populations build up and then drop off. So the entomophagum omega, which is a fungal pathogen that infects the caterpillar life stage, it can kill over 90% of a population in a year. But it is a soil-borne fungus, and it does need to have specific conditions to be able to infect the caterpillars. So it needs nice, cool, wet springs to be able to get spores that can get out of the soil onto a caterpillar, and then when on the caterpillar, able to grow and infect it. So we had pretty dry springs in 2014 and 2015. So this control mechanism that was keeping the populations low for the past 20 to 30 years was suddenly not available. And it allowed these populations to quickly kind of build up in the little pockets where small populations had been able to survive over this time. And as the population built up, eventually we did have, in 2017, we did have a spring where we had appropriate conditions. We had a lot of entomophagum omega infection. But when the populations get really dense, there's a virus, an NPV virus, that can infect the population. So much like humans, that we've all learned a lot over the last year, viruses need individuals to come in contact with each other to be able to spread effectively. So the MPV virus is always kind of present in the gypsy moth out on our landscapes, but it takes, when you get these really high densities, for them to kind of efficiently spread it to each other. So when you have these super dense populations, the virus can kind of wipe out huge quantities. So In 2017, we saw the picture on the far right. Those are all dead caterpillars. So they got infected up in the tree, crawled down, and then died while on the bark. So we saw over 90% population mortality that year. In 2018, we didn't see quite as much entomophaga active as we were hoping. And going into 2019, we were kind of concerned that the population might rebound a little bit again. But we had a kind of weird spring that year where it was cold until late. So we had caterpillars kind of hatching out, but it was cold and wet and they weren't moving up into the canopy and they didn't really start feeding, but their metabolism started going. So we had a ton of hatchlings just starving right outside the egg masses that year. So they died early and didn't really get a chance to feed at all. And then in 2020, we didn't see very much of population at all throughout the state. And going into 2021, we do expect it to be this low level population. So gypsy moth are an invasive species. They've been here for 150 years, but they've kind of been to a level of being naturalized within our system. So they have this fungus that's a control mechanism. They also have other predators. Things like mice eat a lot of the egg masses. Birds will eat the caterpillars. There's other parasitic flies that will infect the egg masses. So with all of these kind of controls, it's come more naturalized and behaves typically more how some of our native forest pests work, but it still is invasive. And when one of those controls kind of isn't working appropriately, it's very easy for these populations to kind of become very robust very quickly, and these insects to cause a lot of damage to our forests. But luckily, we kind of think this outbreak event has come to an end. We're returning to those nice background levels where we might see some activity here and there. It's always going to be part of our forest. We'll always see a little bit of feeding in the state, but not seeing huge, widespread swaths of defoliation, not losing whole trees, not seeing completely bare forests in the middle of the summer. And one of the tools we use to kind of identify the gypsy moth population is an egg mass survey in the winter, where we go out to plots and randomize plots throughout the state and collect information on how many egg masses we actually see in the canopy. So on this map, the blue and greens, those are areas where we really don't expect to see much gypsy moth activity at all. The areas that are orange and red, they are potential sites where there's enough egg masses where if they're able to successfully hatch, get out, feed, and not be impacted by the fungus, we could see noticeable defoliation. But you'll kind of see those are pretty rare and widespread across the state, not everywhere where we were seeing in 2016, 2017. So as I said, we usually have a lag after the gypsy moth outbreak event. So we see this heavy, dense feeding, a lot of widespread, completely barren trees, but a lot of trees can recover from that. And it's not the gypsy moths that can outright kill them, but it's a lot of these other stressors that can kind of build up on the trees and reduce their ability to overcome the feeding from the gypsy moths. The biggest one was the 2016 drought. So nearly everywhere across our entire state of Massachusetts experienced some level of drought in 2016. And by the end of the summer, over 50% of the area was in severe drought conditions, so our highest drought risk area. And the drought continued through the summer, into the fall, and actually through the winter. So it was a very long period of drought, a very stressful condition for a lot of our trees. And oaks are pretty hardy, fairly resilient. And usually when there are droughts like this, most of our oaks will come through the drought fine, but it is a stressful event for them. They're not as productive during that growing season as they usually are. They're not storing as much. They can just get more at risk for other impacts. So the 2016 drought is really what caused this defoliation event to lead to such a widespread oak mortality. Even in the 80s, when we had that biggest 2 million acres impacted by gypsy moth, we didn't see quite as much oak mortality as we saw this time. And we also had other pests that before 2014, 2015 had kind of been impacting a lot of our oaks, particularly out in our coastal areas, black oak gall wasp. So this is a tiny little wasp that grows within the twigs on a black oak tree. and causes a gall, which causes the tips of the trees to kind of die, and it slowly moves in and eventually can kill a black oak tree. But this was pretty widespread in the early 2010s, and it was stressing out a lot of our coastal black oaks. And then the defoliation on top of this led to much more rapid mortality than we would see on just the black oak gall wasp alone or just gypsy moth on its own. We also had other defoliators that were active. So winter moth, luckily we've had great establishment of the biocontrol. Researchers at UMass Amherst and the US Forest Service were able to get the Cyzanix albicans fly to establish and spread throughout our state. So the winter moth populations now are very well controlled by that biocontrol fly. But in 2014 and then in 2015, we were still seeing areas where we were getting noticeable defoliation from winter moth populations. So these areas had already had some defoliation and then got defoliated once again from gypsy moth. So kind of relentless pressure from these two different defoliating pests. So we kind of have all these stressors. Our trees are heavily weakened, going through these events. And some trees they look like they're going to make it. They'll come through the fall, re-leaf out. Our oaks were looking okay, and then the next summer would suddenly die, even though they weren't defoliated that next summer. And it's because when they're stressed and weakened, a lot of secondary pests and pathogens can kind of come in. So we have a lot of native insects and funguses that are always out there in the forest, kind of waiting for their opportunity. So they're natural parts of our forest process. They play a role within our forests. But when we have these unusual events, they can kind of increase and work at a level that they typically don't. And we saw a lot of our native borers in our oaks. So when we go to these oaks that were kind of declining or suddenly died, and when you peel back the bark, you'd see right under the bark in that cambium layer, tons of galleries, tons of active larvae. Most of it was from two-line chestnut borer, which is the insect up in the right corner. So this is a flat-headed borer. It bores in, it just feeds right under the bark in that cambium layer and does end up actually girdling trees. We saw some cerebricids, red oak borer, hickory borer. There were just a lot of active native insects taking this opportunity to be able to get into these trees that they usually can't overcome the defenses and build up their populations very quickly. So huge numbers of these insects throughout our oaks. And then we also saw a lot of our fungal pathogens. Armillaria was probably one of the most common. So armillaria is a root fungus, so it's always kind of present in our soils and starts to creep up from the roots up the trees. So it's also called shoestring fungus. So it has those thick black shoestrings and then white mycelial fans. And it can also kind of girdle and kill a tree as it moves up and feeds on the tree's healthy layers. So all of these are natural. They usually work on individual trees here and there in the forest. We'll kill off our weaker trees that are more stressed, but when all of our oaks are suddenly stressed, these secondary pests and pathogens become much more widespread and kind of take advantage. So these are what actually killed most of our oaks in the end. The gypsy moth didn't technically kill the trees, but they kicked off this event of decline, stress, and secondary pests coming in. And then even now that the gypsy moth event is over, our secondary pests are kind of decreasing. We still do have ongoing forest stressors to our oaks. So these are common other pests and pathogens out there again that continue to put a little bit of stress on some of the oaks that made it through this event. So we are seeing the mortality event kind of trails off as trees don't fully recover. So after we saw things like licanium scale, we saw that a lot out on Martha's Vineyard and out in Cape Cod, which are just scales that feed on the twigs of oaks. Usually pretty harmless, don't cause a lot of damage, but when you have these oaks that hadn't really fully recovered from stressful events, it can cause twig dieback, branch dieback, and on trees that are very weakened, it can kill them. We saw a shot hole leaf miner, which usually just causes these little holes in our leaves and some leaves to drop. So not a big deal, but when trees are really trying to get as much photosynthesizing done as possible and be at their peak ability, having holes that then open them up to other leaf funguses, anthracnose, and things like that. It's not ideal. It's not the best for our trees to fully recover. And then we have other caterpillars that are always out there. In Central Mass, particularly around the Quabbin area, we saw a lot of fall webworm feeding, which it's background pest. We see it once in a while, but once again, when trees are kind of stressed, having another defoliator show up isn't great. And then out on Nantucket, we've been having big issues with fall cankerworm. So this is an early season defoliator. Looks very similar to winter moth, these little looper kind of caterpillars. And they've had 3 years in a row of defoliation from cankerworm out there. Also seeing some cankerworm pockets throughout the Cape as well. So these are just native insects. And then some of our less prolific invasives, we've just kind of been noticing more. People have been more aware and causing a little bit more damage because our oaks are kind of stressed and more vulnerable to these very normal insects that are kind of out there. And having this widespread event led to a lot of hazardous trees in our landscape. So now we have a much higher than usual number of dead trees. Having dead trees is totally normal. It's a normal process. Trees don't live forever. So we do have dead trees from in the forest, in our communities, in our urban settings. But having such a large number and having so many trees in the same cohort, so many of these large, similar aged oaks dying all at once, has become a real burden for many in the state. So homeowners dealing with trees in their yards, towns dealing with trees impacting their roads, power line companies dealing with these trees that have been taking out power lines in these storms afterwards. So it's been a big economic impact. There's still many standing dead oaks out there just because it's impossible to kind of keep up with the number and sheer volume of trees that were out there. And we lost some pretty valuable trees. So this is a very large oak that was at the entrance to the Quabbin as you go towards the visitor center. And it just didn't make it through this event. It was there when the Quabbin was formed, but we had to remove it in 2019. And a lot of people, homeowners having to get specialized equipment and companies coming in because these trees are so big and kind of are at risk for their homes and cars, their children out in their yards, things like that. And then out in the forests, so a dead tree in the forest can be valuable. It is home to wildlife. It is a part of the decaying process. It opens up light pockets that can allow other trees to grow up, to allow some variability in age class and composition of the forests. But when you lose these big pockets, it can be kind of a bigger risk, or in areas where you have invasives or other undesirable plants that will fill those pockets, there is some management that might be necessary. So going in and kind of helping the forests along in some ways. There are also a lot of landowners where they invest their money and kind of need the returns from their forest. So losing large stocks of oak was pretty impactful to them, and they did a lot of salvage and recovery of our oak woods. But you kind of have to act pretty quickly since we have so many of those secondary pests, those insects getting in there, those funguses getting in and staining the wood. Action kind of had to be pretty quick to actually get value out of a lot of the lumber in there. So we still have a lot of dead oaks out in our forest, and there's a lot of research going on from the U.S. Forest Service on kind of what the composition and what we can kind of expect for changes in our forests after this. And what kind of kicked off this whole event is the influence of a changing climate. So we're having changes in precipitation, changing in our growing season length, changing in their temperatures, which impacted things like the entomophaga fungus, which control the gypsy moth population. So going forward, we don't really know the influence a changing climate might have on our oak tree populations, if events like this might become more common, or if we'll see something like this again in the future. But things like increasing temperatures can open us up to new invasive species that weren't able to exist here before, but also altering our natives our native pests that are here, altering the controls and population dynamics of some of our already present um, invasive populations. We are expected to see changes in precipitation patterns. So here in the Northeast, we're not going to see more or less precipitation, but kind of how we receive that can change. And things like funguses can really be impacted like that. Trees themselves going through these drought periods, or oaks don't really particularly being very wet. And some sites now are becoming more wet or too wet for oaks, um, or going through periods where it's just too dry and too harsh for some of our trees. And then increased storm events. So we had these weakened trees have some branch dieback, and now we're having storms that kind of cause them to have area sections of the trees getting ripped off, causing more damage that they have to put them at a more risk for invasion by other trees. Um, and I just want to say a lot of this can seem really negative, that we did lose so many trees and that we are still at risk going forward. But we're still going to have oaks here in Massachusetts. These trees have been here for thousands of years. They are an important part of our forest composition. And a lot of the oak forests in Massachusetts have kind of grown with gypsy moth. So this picture is of the Quabbin Reservoir being formed in the 1930s. Huge areas of trees cut down. A lot of the area around it was still farmlands and pasture lands. So our oak forest grew up from this point in the 1930s to now in the 2020s, with gypsy moth that whole time. By this point, we had already had several gypsy moth outbreak events in the areas. The population of gypsy moth had already been in Massachusetts for 50 years. So our forest developed with gypsy moth there, and now we have these very robust oak forests. So gypsy moth's not going to be the end of our trees. We did lose a large number, and it has been burdensome to many across the state. But we still have trees, we still have huge numbers. And when we do say we lost 57,000 acres of trees, we didn't lose 57,000 full acres of trees. In nearly all of those acres, we still have many mature, healthy oaks to grow and expand into those things, into those openings, new trees that'll be able to grow up from the understory. So if you have any other questions about our oaks in our state, gypsy moth, or some of our other forest health threats to our oaks, please feel free to reach out. My email is NicoleKeleher@mass.gov, or you can go on the mass.gov website and look for some of our forest health program pages that have a lot of great information about our insects and diseases that we see in our forests throughout the state. Thank you.